Bueno, entonces, buenas tardes. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Voy a, obviamente, dar la bienvenida en español primero, pero dado en honor de nuestro invitado especial, ya voy a ir hablar en mi lengua materna, pero a veces la gente piensa que no es mi lengua materna inglés. I am really, really very proud and honored to have Rich Sauer. The thing is that Rich is basically corporate vice president, but in some sense much more important, I think, than that in one sense, is that Rich is the guy who has the responsibility for trying to coordinate and direct the efforts of all of Microsoft, and especially the part of Microsoft associated with research in AI from the point of view of government regulation, ethics, particularly ethics. And why is that incredibly important nowadays? Because we're living through a revolution that's affecting everybody's lives, and Rich will show some examples of that, where we're having to face enormous challenges from the point of view of what the correct ethical perspective on what artificial intelligence is going to be doing for us and what it shouldn't be doing for us in the next decades. It's going to affect our lives, but our children's lives as well. And I don't think there'll be many more people who are more expert on this issue than Rich himself. And we've already had some wonderful discussions. And I think it's going to be very useful for us to be able to get the viewpoint of somebody who's at the very center of these very important issues with a company with a global impact as large as Microsoft's. So the thing is that Rich is going to give us a 30-minute talk, more or less, I think, right, Rich? And then the thing is that we'd love to have a question and answer session, in the sense of, I think there's very deep issues to be discussed here. And having spent quite some of today with Rich, he's a very open guy and extremely knowledgeable. And so the thing is, it would be great to get some questions from the audience, because if not, I'll have them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It was very, very kind and very gracious introduction. Thank you all for being here. This is my first trip to the campus here, and I'm extremely impressed. It's not my first trip to Mexico City. In fact, I was just here last February, and I can't remember the time before that, but I've spent time with Rebecca and Armida and Daniel and the team here many times. But this is my first time to Mexico in sort of the new capacity of this job that I have. And so I am almost a 20-year veteran of Microsoft. I've worked in a variety of different capacities. I've worked primarily in our headquarters outside of Seattle in the northwest of the United States. I spent 5 years in Singapore at one point during my career. I came back, did a number of different things. But then in May, I shifted again and I moved into essentially a role where I support the head of Microsoft's artificial intelligence and research team, a gentleman named Harry Shum. And this is a global team with research centers, spread across the world, a huge presence in Beijing, a huge presence in Cambridge, England, and a number of other places as well. So it's a real privilege for me to support that team. But the thing that I am spending the most time on, it really is this issue about ethics and artificial intelligence, and it's become a very sort of hot topic. I appreciate you saying I'm an expert in the field. I'd say I am learning. And what I thought I could share with you today is a little bit of what that learning journey has been like and what we've been sort of grappling with as a company in this space. So let me sort of take you through just a few things here. Then, as Chris said, we'll hopefully have some time for questions. I'd love to just open it up at that point in time. So I often just sort of start here when I talk to audience, just to sort of level set on what artificial intelligence actually is and what does this actually mean. And what I often comment here is I'll sort of benefit from the wisdom I've gotten from some of our researchers who've sort of taught me everything I know about the topic. But essentially, partly what they'll say to me is, this term's completely meaningless. It's used by so many people to mean so many different things, from relatively mundane, uninteresting applications all the way through, killer robots taking over the world and everything in between, that nobody really even knows what artificial intelligence actually means, which I think is interesting. I think it's an interesting concept. Alan Turing. So the point here is that it has been around for a long time. It's been around certainly at least since the 1940s, 1950s, when Mr. Turing was doing his work in Cambridge as well. And at the time, and what a lot of people thought of as the aspiration for artificial intelligence was something along this lines. Can a machine exhibit intelligent behavior that is equivalent to or beyond the capabilities of a human? And that is what they sort of think of. That's sort of what we're seeking to achieve in this space. And for me, I think that's sort of interesting. I think it's sort of exciting if we can get there. Some might think that's quite concerning and scary, and I understand that point of view as well. But what our researchers tell us, and it's actually Chris Bishop is the person who I'll attribute this to, who's the head of our lab in Cambridge, he would say, if a few years ago we were 1% of the way there to this, achieving this aspiration, today maybe we're 2%. It is a long, long way off before you get to this aspiration of truly, machines with the equivalent of human intelligence. But that's not to say there's not a lot of exciting things going on. There really are a lot of exciting things going on. There is, we have capability today in the technology industry for technology to basically have, on human parity, operate at the same level of a human in areas of, speech recognition, translation, machine reading, things of that nature, object recognition, computer vision. So we are at parity, which does not mean we're perfect. The humans aren't perfect at this either, but machines can operate at about that level. And what's driving that is essentially not so much artificial intelligence, or let's just say it's a subset of artificial intelligence called machine learning. And what machine learning is, think of it as, computers taking in a large amounts of data and then basically processing that data to find patterns. Find patterns in the data, find matches in the data, and then make some predictions based on what those patterns and those matches are. And the question is sort of, why now is all this sort of in the news, and why have I shifted gears in May to go work in this area, and why is this all of a sudden a big topic? The way we think about it, we think it's probably 3 reasons, and there may be, I may tack on a 4th. I think I've promised to do that a couple times when I've talked about this today, but I never did. One is computer power, massive computer power driven largely by cloud computing, making computing power available to the masses. It's not just the privileged few, those who can afford it. It's now much more affordable, much more ubiquitous, and through many, many companies, ourselves, Microsoft included, but Amazon, Google, others, there's many companies in this space. And so there are hyper-scale data centers cropping up all over the world to provide that level of power and a new sort of shift for the industry. Couple that with big data. There's just this explosion of data in the world with all the devices and all the internet connected devices and telephones and smartphones and everything else, automobiles, you name it. So many of these things today that we use and we carry around with us are connected. And they're throwing off data, they're throwing off telemetry, they're there's a term, calling home, they basically report back. If depending on how your phone's set up, your GPS data may be right now telling some provider exactly where you are and where you were most of the day. And all of that data is being accumulated in these large data centers. And then in between is these algorithms, these very powerful algorithms. And I don't purport to be a coder or a programmer or to precisely know how all of this works. And if they were here, they can explain it. And some of you would follow it along beautifully, and they would talk about deep neural networks and everything else. Fascinating topic area. But the way they explain it to me in a way that I can understand, and that hopefully those of you who aren't who are sort of at my level of artificial intelligence literacy can understand, is think of these as a change in the way that our programmers write code or our computer scientists write code. In the old days, they wrote code that was essentially a set of directions. They would tell a computer do X, then Y, and then turn right, and then go left, and then turn on that transistor and light up that red light, and that would have an outcome. And it was basically they had something they were trying to accomplish. There was an answer they wanted the computer to be able to derive, and they would put the directions into a computer to be able to do that. But with algorithms in the new model, essentially what they're doing is they're creating software and they're writing code that basically teaches a computer to learn, and then they're using data to train the algorithm. And so it's the data, the algorithm, and the computing power coming together that make this sort of why this now is such a big, powerful thing. And the 4th thing I would add to this is just the infusion of talent and money and focus. There is just so much attention being given to this area and so much, just mind share flowing into it as well, that too is contributing to sort of the more recent advances and gains in the area. So then, here's what I'd like to talk about why this is a good thing. Why is this positive? Why should you be excited about it? This is how our CEO thinks about it. It's not just another piece of technology. This could be one of the world's most fundamental pieces of technology that humankind has ever invented. Others will say, I want to say IBM, I think, goes around and compares artificial intelligence to sort of like the discovery of fire, and there's electricity sometimes is a comparison. So there's a lot of big words thrown around in this area. To give you some sort of specific examples, and these are things you probably know and you're quite familiar with, but the personal assistants that you carry around, again, on your smartphone, as this learns more about you and has more access to more of the services that you use and your email and your calendar and gets to know you better, it becomes smarter and it can do more for you. It can anticipate your needs. It could help you be more productive. It can get you to meetings on time. It can tell you to leave 10 minutes earlier than you plan to leave because traffic is going to be bad, and it knows where you're going and it knows what you have planned. So that's sort of, that is maybe not the changing the world kind of a breakthrough, but it's certainly a convenience. Healthcare is an interesting one, and Chris and I had this discussion on the way over here in the car. Lots of opportunity, and Chris actually taught me some things that I didn't know about behavioral data and other things that you're not going to find in medical records. But there is this ability to take, large amounts of data, medical records that exist, perhaps infuse that with other data that we need to figure out how to gather and collect to understand what people's behavior and habits are. But you can imagine it's such a massive amounts of data that just a person trying to go through this on a spreadsheet would not be able to see sort of what some of these connections are and what some of these patterns are. And this is an area where AI can, I think, do a lot and have a lot of promise. Self-driving cars is always in the news. You know a lot about it. Agriculture is a great space where, through cheap sensors and things like this, that, we can do precision farming, make sure that when we irrigate, just enough and not too much, and don't waste water, don't waste pesticides, don't waste fertilizer, and increase yields. So all of those are things that are real life examples, things that are happening. But the area that I think is sort of the most compelling is with respect to people with disabilities. And when we think about this community, sort of the numbers that we look at suggest that there's about 1 billion people on the planet, 1 in every 7 persons on the planet that has some sort of a disability, maybe temporary, maybe permanent, maybe severe, maybe less so. But as a result, they may be impaired in some way from either contributing fully to economies or from participating just in societies. And this is an area where we feel like AI can play a big role. And if it works, I'll play a video that I hope will play and will demonstrate that.
I'm Sachi Shake. I lost my sight when I was 7, and shortly after that I went to a school for the blind, and that's where I was introduced to talking computers, and that really opened up a whole new world of opportunities. I joined Microsoft 10 years ago as a software engineer. I love making things which improve people's lives. And one of the things I've always dreamt of since I was at university was this idea of something that could tell you at any moment what's going on around you.
I think it's a man jumping in the air doing a trick on a skateboard.
I teamed up with like-minded engineers to make an app which lets you know who and what is around you. It's based on top of the Microsoft Intelligence APIs, which makes it so much easier to make this kind of thing. The app runs art classes. When you're talking to a bigger group, sometimes you can talk and there's no response and you think, is everyone listening really well, or are they half asleep? And you never know.
I see 2 faces, 40-year-old man with a beard looking surprised, 20-year-old woman looking happy.
The app can describe the general age and gender of the people around me and what their emotions are, which is incredible. One of the things that's most useful about the app is the ability to read out text.
Hello, good afternoon. Here's your menu.
Great, thank you. I can use the app on my phone to take a picture of the menu, and it's going to guide me on how to take that correct photo.
Move camera to the bottom right and away from the document.
and then it'll recognize the text. Read me the headings.
I see appetizers, salads, paninis, pizzas, pastas.
Years ago, this was science fiction. I never thought to do, but artificial intelligence is improving at an ever faster rate, and I'm really excited to see where we can take this. As engineers, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants, building on top of what went before. And in this case, we've taken years of research from Microsoft Research to pull this off.
I think it's a young girl throwing an orange frisbee in the park.
For me, it's about taking that far-off dream and building it one step at a time. I think this is just the beginning.
So what I like about that video, it's all real technology. It's real technology in use today. It's real technology available today in the United States. It's not available everywhere. And the only reason it's not available everywhere is it's actually, in many countries, it's a regulated medical device. And so you actually have to go through a relatively rigorous process to have it certified and put into use, which kind of surprised me. It doesn't strike me as the sort of thing that would fall into that category, but I'm not I'm not a regulatory lawyer in the healthcare area, but it is something we're pushing to put in more places. But everything you saw there was real. That's actually functioning application, and it's not a vision video or anything along those lines. And it's a good overview of some of the technology. It's facial recognition you saw in there. You saw object recognition. You saw translation. You saw reading, all done through AI and through data. But so despite all of this sort of opportunity and promise, there are these challenges. And one of the challenges, quite frankly, is there is a concern increasingly, and this is something that's probably increased over the past couple of years, where in some ways I think largely due to data privacy and data security and data breach and sort of those issues, that the tech companies, which at one point I sort of feel like we were the darlings of a lot of the economies around the world, in some ways have become thought of quite differently. And we've got Cambridge Analytica, and Chris and I spent a lot of time talking about fake news and issues with social media. And that has created a bit of a challenging dynamic for us. And partly it's the technology is quite powerful, which gives people concern. Partly is, the technology companies have a lot of influence, and that gives people concern. And then increasingly what we're seeing in the headlines are things related to specifically artificial intelligence. And so this past spring and summer is just a good example of that. And I'll take you for a very quick tour through. Essentially, this is my first 3 months in my new job. I started this job and I thought all was going to be relatively calm and sedate, but then things sort of took off quickly. So in May, sort of these headlines like this were sort of hitting the press, at least in the United States, which was about Google. And basically, a number of employees at Google became very concerned when they learned that Google was essentially bid for and won a contract with the U.S. Department of Defense to support a project called Maven, which was essentially using artificial intelligence to make drones that the military use, smarter and more precise, and to be able to navigate uneven terrain, more effectively. And Google's employees were not happy about it. Google, as any company would do when you get sort of caught on your back foot on something like this, they sort of fumbled around for a couple of weeks, but eventually they came out with a set of principles which are very thoughtful, and they came out with a position that they are not going to be in the business of supporting weapons technology, or at least with respect to AI. And they eventually said that they would withdraw from this contract when it expires at the end of next year. And then last week, there was a big opportunity that a lot of technology companies were bidding for with respect to Pentagon contract, which they actually declined to bid in. So they actually have made a very firm stance with respect to weapons and AI. The next big headline came just really a week later involving what's called the ACLU. It stands for the American Civil Liberties Union. So it's a very reputable, very talented group of lawyers and other professionals that essentially advocate in the United States for civil rights. And what the ACLU's concern here involves Amazon and a piece of technology they have called recognition, which is facial recognition technology. And the concern that the ACLU had is that Amazon was licensing this technology to government, and government now would have at least the potential to use it to essentially monitor public spaces and constantly sort of identify who's there, who's in the public park. There's a police protest. Maybe there's a protest happening in a downtown park about police brutality. And theoretically, they could sort of identify, use the technology to try and identify the people who are participating in that rally. Or just the community's knowledge that that technology exists might actually dissuade them from showing up for something like that, because they don't want to show up and sort of exercise their rights to free speech or free expression, because they realize they're going to be on camera and there's going to be a permanent record made of them that they've been participating in these sorts of rallies. And so the ACLU took issue with Amazon on this issue, filed what they call a public action, which is a very, they sort of stand up a public website. They asked for people to join the cause. They got about 250,000 petitions signed from online from people who were equally concerned. They then boxed them up, took them down to Amazon's headquarters, which is Amazon's our neighbor just not far from us in Seattle. We're close in proximity to each other. They went down, delivered all these petitions, and then they even went a little further where they did this technique, which is really more of a publicity stunt than anything else. But what they ended up doing is they went to the United States Congress and basically got all of the pictures of the 400 or 500 members of Congress that serve in the United States. And then they got another database of convicted felons and what we would call in the United States their mugshots, their pictures that were taken when they were booked into prison. And they ran a test to see how many of these members of Congress can be matched up with how many people in this mugshot database. And they found that there were 28 members of Congress that matched, which turned out those were all false positives. And the challenge with this was that the technology was run at a confidence rating of about 85% confidence. Because the way this technology works, it doesn't just say yes, no. What it says is, basically it says, I think so. And I think so and I have about an 85% confidence that that person in this database is the same person I see over here. And Amazon responded, I think rightfully so, saying you would never run our technology at that low level of confidence for something this sensitive, which is a fair criticism. But it served the ACLU's purposes well. They got a lot of good press and a lot more attention. But I don't want you to think I just came to Mexico City to pick on our competitors and tell you just how tough their life has been. We've had our own moment, I guess, in the media soon after, which involved essentially the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And the facts here are pretty straightforward, which is essentially at a time in the United States when issues related to, the acronym is ICE, when issues related to ICE were at a fevered pitch, because essentially the Trump administration had enacted a policy that essentially said at the southern border of the United States and the northern border of Mexico, that if people were coming across the border without authorization as a family, what they would do is they would detain them, and then they would separate the children from the parents, and they would process the parents in some way, and they would go put the children in some other facility or in foster care or something along those lines. And there was an uprising of concern in the United States about this policy. Well, one weekend, a researcher did some research online and stumbled across an old blog. It was about 6 months previous, old from us, that a marketing person wrote that basically said, we had just passed some certification, so our technology was now able to be purchased by ICE and by the Homeland Security because we met some security standard. We cleared a bar that you have to clear to get to be eligible to do government contracting. And then, as marketing people often do, they added a whole bunch of hype. And they said, oh, this is a fantastic moment for Microsoft's technology, and this demonstrates how good we are, and ICE is now going to have our technology to do all sorts of interesting things and use the best of what we have, including our facial recognition and so on and so forth. None of that was accurate. The reality is when we saw this, we double-checked and triple-checked, and we found out that ICE was using none of that technology. They were not using facial recognition. They weren't using anything related to artificial intelligence. They were using some, what you would think of as email, and moving some old legacy things off of old servers onto new technology, but very relatively uninteresting, somewhat mundane stuff, and nothing at the southern border of the United States. So we came out strongly in response and sort of set the record straight. And we also went on the record quite clearly and said that we found the Trump administration's policy on the southern border to be abhorrent, and that we recommended strongly that they rethink it, which in some extents I think they have, but it's still an issue of some contention. The reason I share all this with you is not for you to have sympathy for how rough my summer was, but for you to understand that it's interesting that all of these issues, none of them implicate anything that has anything to do with regulation or the law. Amazon is perfectly within its legal rights to sell facial recognition to any government in the world if they want, with very few exceptions. We are perfectly within our rights if we wanted to, and we're not. But if we wanted to sell facial recognition technology to the Department of Homeland Security, we could do that. And Google, if they want to be a defense contractor, they can do that too. But all of these things raised ethical issues, and the concerns being expressed by our employees, by the media, by people across all different fields was more about the ethics of these decisions and should we be doing these sorts of things. So that sort of brings me to the definition of what does that even mean? And so essentially, this is just one definition out of Wikipedia. It's maybe not the best, but essentially ethics is all about values and morality and, good versus bad or good versus evil. And it's also one of those areas, it's an interesting area where if you talk to ethicists, it's often most of the hard issues don't really have a right answer. And what they mostly want you to do is pause, consider it, reflect on it, think about your values, and weigh these decisions. But they're often, and different people could have a different point of view. Different people have different values, and different people have ethical constructs that they align to. And then it gets even more complicated if you're a global business and you do business around the world, because ethics mean different things in different places. Certainly in China versus, the West, the East versus the West, Confucius versus Socrates, pick your favorite philosopher, there are different perspectives, which makes it complicated. The other challenge is, and when you bring it back to AI, that if we're moving into a world where computers are making more and more and more of the decisions in an automated way that were once reserved exclusively for human beings, then that means all of these hard, human rights and ethics decisions are now coming to technology and they're coming to computers. So the way we tend to think about it, it's not we don't sit around and think, what's the maximum thing we can do with the technology? What's the most we can push it? How hard, how fast can we go? We pause and we say, not what can it do, but what should the computer do? And that sort of guides a lot of what the work we do in this space. So I'm going to take you just through quickly this is sort of our learnings, and these are things that we're doing essentially to try and address sort of these issues and grapple through these problems. But I will promise you, it's one, not the only prescription for how to unlock the promise of AI. And I say that because this is such a new area. We're all struggling with it. We've made mistakes. We're going to make more mistakes, and we're going to learn. And this is sort of our best sort of view at this point in time. And if you invite me to come back sometime in the future, I'll have a whole bunch more to say about this topic. But let me talk you through what we're doing now. First, we think this thing starts at the very top. It's all about trust. And for us, this is very, very important to us. We will cease to exist as a business if we didn't have our customers' trust. If customers don't trust our technology, they won't buy our technology. That's why we think this is sort of our North Star as we think about how to navigate through the issues. We then sort of break it into three categories. We first have a vision for how we're going to design our technology. And our vision is really, it's about augmenting human capability and human ability. It's not about replacing human ability. And so we think about this, and one of the examples that I always like is in radiology. So people who read x-rays for a living. There was a very big concern, like these people are going to be out of a job in a very short amount of time because the computers are going to take that work over and they're going to do a better job. The reality is today is that a computer, an error rate for a top radiologist who is well-trained and well-skilled with a lot of experience is somewhere around 92% is what I understand, or their accuracy rate. So they have about an 8% error rate. A machine doing the same thing can hit pretty close to that same target. But it turns out when you actually take the radiologist and marry them up with the technology, then the accuracy rate goes up to about 99%. So it's it's much improved. And so they use the artificial intelligence not as a replacement, more as a tool. So that is the business that we want to be in. So we think that's part of the answer. The other part of it, second piece of this is it's all about, we try and make our technology broadly available. We don't want to be basically a fortress where we're running these code and we are the only ones who know how this stuff works. And if you need to use it, you need to come to us. We try and make it available. It's sort of the philosophy we've had really since the beginning of the company. Sort of mission is now very focused on what we call digital transformation. So we are out trying to work with companies, often companies who are very traditional, and help them embrace technology in ways that make them more successful so that they can grow their business, so that they can add more jobs and increase revenue or whatever their goals might be. And we don't succeed if our customers don't succeed. And so that's the second approach that we're also taking to AI. And then the third leg of this three-legged stool is really this ethical principles. And that's not just having principles. There's a lot of principles out there. It's not just writing a bunch of principles down, but it's actually then putting them into action. But we did start where you need to start, where you need to figure out what they are. And so we wrote a book in January of this year and published it. We talked a bit about, the impact of AI on society. We talked a lot in this book in an unusual way for a technology company about not just what's great about technology, but we talked about the concerns. Half of this book is dedicated to job loss, disruption, and at least some suggestions we have for policymakers on things we should be doing now to address that before those days, before it's upon us, so to try and get ahead of it. But we also published these 6 principles as part of it as well. So fairness, it's about, making sure computers aren't biased. Reliability and safety, which is a concept that has sort of been in the technology industry for quite a long time. Privacy and security, which is really all about data, because the data is such an important part of this process, and it's a large amount of data, and it's often very sensitive data. And inclusiveness goes more towards sort of the video you saw, making sure this technology is available to everybody. We underpin that with transparency so that people can basically understand what we're doing and understand how this technology works. And then at the very bottom is accountability to make sure that people and a human ultimately is responsible for the technology that's developed or the technology that's deployed. I'll take you through just a couple of these to give you just a little bit more color about them. Fairness is a very hard issue, it turns out. This is a New York Times article from February of this year. And what this article represents is that a number of technology companies, IBM, Face++, Microsoft included, we all released this facial recognition technology. And then 2 researchers, one of which was a Microsoft researcher, basically did some tests. And what they found out, one of the things the technology does, as you sort of saw a little bit in the video, is it can tell if you're a man or a woman. Or it will, if you put a picture in front of it, at least it will make a guess, or it will do its best to identify men versus women. So these researchers took this technology and fed it a bunch of images to see how it performed. And what they found out is that if you were a white male, it did a very good job distinguishing that you were a white male. If you were a white female, it was pretty good, but not as good as if you were a white male. If you were a person of color, it was not particularly good. And if you were a person of color, it was particularly bad. In fact, it had the error rates for one of the vendors' products that was tested were about 35% error rates for women of color. And the error rates for white males was 1%. And so it was dramatic difference. So we thought, what happened? How did we release this technology and why does it perform so badly? So we brought it back and we tore it apart and took it to the lab or to the workshop and tried to figure it out. And there were small things here and there that we needed to fix, but the most significant change, the real root cause of the problem, was the data set that was used to train the algorithm. What the data set basically showed when you look deeply into this data set of hundreds of thousands of images was that it was predominantly images of white men. And so what the algorithm did is it learned the most it could learn about white men, because that's the data it was fed. It was very underrepresented of people of color. So what we did is we went out and we spent a lot of time basically improving the data set and then reran the test and vastly improved our performance. And so it was a very big, it was a humbling, but a learning opportunity for us as a company. And so we're taking the learnings that we've learned here the hard way, and we're applying them now across all that we do in this space. But that's sort of an illustration of the challenges on fairness. This is an interesting development that started in July for us. This actually comes from both that ACLU Amazon case and our own issues on that ICE fiasco, which essentially it highlighted for us that facial recognition was a particularly sensitive topic, and facial recognition that identifies specific individuals as the individuals they are is maybe the most sensitive area of all. And so what we did in this blog, we published this blog on July 13th, and first of all, we took on a number of commitments. We said, look, we're going to do a certain number of things. We're going to be more transparent about our technology, what it does well and what it doesn't do well. We're going to double down on fairness and bias. We're going to diversify our workforce of the people who work on this technology. And then we're eventually going to write some principles, which we have now in draft, and they should be available soon. but to govern our own development and deployment of facial recognition. So that was all interesting, but the thing that was most interesting about it that captured the most attention was we said we want to be regulated, which is a weird thing for a technology company to say, because technology companies' typical sort of marching orders are, leave us alone, government, we know better than you, and if you get involved, you're just going to slow down innovation, and that's a bad thing. But we actually said we want to be regulated because this technology is so sensitive and in the wrong hands can be so misused, we think the government should tell us what to do. And in particular, it's the hardest challenge of all in the surveillance space, which is, what is the balance that you want to draw between public safety on one hand, an important role for government to play to keep us all safe, and personal privacy on the other hand? They are absolutely in tension. And so it feels to us it would be very weird for Microsoft to be coming to Mexico City and saying, we've got this facial recognition technology. It can do amazing things in the public safety, arena, but we've decided we're not going to license it to you, Mexico City government, because we've decided it's not the right thing to do. We could do that, but we sort of feel like, shouldn't the elected representatives of Mexico City determine how this technology should be used? And if you live here, if you're a citizen here, if you don't like what they decide, then maybe you should get different representatives. But that seems to us to be the right way to approach this. Don't leave this to some, Pacific Northwest company to sort of decide on your behalf. So that's the approach we've taken there. I'll give you a couple other examples of things we've done to sort of put the principles into action. One is we've created this committee. It's essentially our AI ethics committee. It's called the Ether Committee. It stands for AI Ethics and Effects in Engineering and Research. It's about 12 members. I'm the secretary of this committee and a member of it. We have these 7 working groups, which spend a lot of time trying to sort of think through these hard problems and create best practices or tool sets or guidelines or even rules for the engineering groups to follow so that when they build AI-infused products, they build them with ethics in mind from the ground up. And so that's a lot of what we're focused on as that committee. But the challenges with the technology that even if you make the technology perfect when it leaves the factory floor, if it falls into the wrong hands, it can be misused. It's all dual-use technology. So facial recognition used to protect public safety can just as easily be used to sort of turn that same cameras and that same technology on a human rights advocate who's complaining about the government or a journalist who's writing things that the government doesn't like. And so you have to be careful about how you then sell this product as well and who you sell this product to. So we have a sort of a test that we use, it's called sensitive uses or consequential use cases. So we think hard if it's a case that involves a human rights issue, if it's a case that involves physical or emotional harm, or if it's what we would call a consequential service, which could be many, many things. A loan. If you are applying for a loan to go to school or start a business, and an algorithm is sort of making the decision as to whether or not you're sort of a good credit risk for the bank, that has consequential impact on your life if that algorithm gets it wrong and denies you that loan. So things like loans can be a consequential decision that we want to pay close attention to. Criminal justice systems and sentencing guidelines, all of those things come into play here. Health issues as well are sort of probably more in the risks of harm. But that's another approach that we take as we think about the technology. And it's actually real. I mean, we actually do turn down work. We say no to opportunities that would be lucrative, that would be financially rewarding, but if they don't comport or comply with our principles, we will say no. And it's important that if you are going to write these principles, you better make them more than just words on paper, and you better live up to them. And so we do. And this is an article. This is actually Eric Horvitz, he's the chairman of our Ether committee. He's also the head of our research group. He's a brilliant data scientist. He said this at a conference at Carnegie Mellon University. He was completely unauthorized to say this, but he said it anyway. He didn't realize press was in the room. And at the end of the day, we were happy he said it because it's been a useful topic for us to talk about. This is just a little thing, but I think it's interesting. So I work on this, our main campus, which is about 80 acres of land in the northwest of the United States. And on our campus, there are 7 doors that we call AI learning doors. And what these doors are, essentially, when I go in and out of any door in any building on campus, I wear a card key with my picture on it, and I have to take the card key and I have to swipe it in front of this reader right here. I have to swipe it in front of this reader, and the door will unlock, and it identifies me as I'm secure and I'm allowed to be there, and it lets me in. So what they're testing at this door are facial recognition technology, and what they're doing is we still have to use your badge to go in and out, but then once you go in the door, there's cameras, and the cameras are basically taking your picture and they're trying to identify you, and it's testing it to say, you just swiped in as Rich Sauer. Let me see if the cameras also figure out that you're Rich Sauer as well. And today is a cloudy day, or today the light is bright, or the light's dark, or you're turned sideways, and trying to do all the different angles and all of that to see is this technology fit for purpose if you wanted to use it to basically as an authentication in a very secure environment. But that's not what's so interesting about these doors. What I think is interesting about these doors are two things. One is, when you approach the door, there's this very big notice that says, this is an AI learning door. And it tells you all about the door and what we're doing at the door and how your data is going to be captured and so on. So you can make a decision and say, whoa, hang on a minute. I don't really want to be part of this experiment. I think I'll go in the door just over there, which doesn't have a bunch of cameras trained on me. So you're welcome to essentially opt out with your feet. But if you inadvertently walk in through the door and you didn't realize that you were, and then you decide, or later you decide, I don't really want to be part of that experiment, we give you the ability to opt out. You can go online, click on one place, say, basically delete all my pictures, delete any data you have about me there. I don't want to be part of this experiment, which is just part of what we think is a responsible way to deploy this kind of technology. So we do it ourselves, and we actually encourage our customers to think the same way. This slide just illustrates the point that I personally do not think that ethics is one of those areas where companies should be competing against each other. I don't think we should try and out-differentiate Google because we're more or less or differently ethical than they are. I think it's an area where we're better served if we all come together. And the reality is we are, at least at some level. This is nascent, but there's something called the Partnership on AI. We're a founding member. There's a lot of the big tech companies that are all very Western, but big, U.S. tech companies are founding members, and then we've added a bunch more, and now we're growing, and we're adding people all the time. Baidu just joined last Thursday, which is great to have a company of both of that stature, but also a company from China in, which gives me hope, I guess I would say. So this is the place where we hope to, we have hope there's really good benefits will flow from this if we can execute well. The last thing I'll close on is just, I want to just flag that we are investing. And we're investing in some of these, what we think of as very hard problems. This isn't really an ethics issue, but I do think it's a trust issue. So what we're trying to do here, in part, this is not motivated entirely by trust. It's motivated by we feel like this is partly our corporate responsibility. But we also need to have more examples of AI used in the benefit of society. AI for good is what we call this initiative. We've created a set of programs. Under AI for Earth, we're focused on biodiversity, climate change, water, and agriculture. What we've done is we've taken $50 million and we've set it aside, and we make it available as grant money for academics, NGOs, people working in this space to sort of try and tackle these hard issues. So we're going to try and provide them with technology and money and hopefully AI to make whatever they're trying to do even that much more successful. On accessibility, it's similar, and it's sort of the technology you saw in that video is something that came out of what we call a Microsoft hackathon, where we bring our people together and just give them a week where they can just go work on some of these projects for good, and we'll do more of that. And then our latest is AI for Humanitarian Action, and it kind of covers these areas of disaster relief, needs for children, refugees and displaced people, and human rights. And that's a program we just put $40 million into, and I think we'll run it very similar to the AI for Earth program. So that is mostly what I wanted to share with you today. I appreciate you being here and letting me share it. Our hope is if we can execute well in these areas, we can not only ensure that AI engenders trust, but that it empowers all of us. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much, and I appreciate it, the time.
Does anyone got a question? Yep.
Can we get a copy of the
slides?
Of the slides, but also the book?
Sure,
I
absolutely.
The book is
absolutely.
Open.
We will. I need your card, and if you give me your card, we'll get it to you right. We'll get it to you right away.
Yes.
And we have it in Spanish too. Do we translate it?
Yes, we have it.
Okay, good.
Yes. And the other thing is, I used to work in NEC, the Japanese company that's supposed to be leader in
Yeah.
facial recognition. But I think this facial recognition has long time. But the issue is not only facial; it's all biometrics, because you have different biometrics that is, is retina or
Right.
fingers. So basically, my question is Microsoft working in all the biometrics legal issues, or is just because facial recognition is something is increasing, but it's not very secure. But normally now the tendency is to have multiple biometrics, no?
The
In the same scenario, no?
It's a great question. The biometrics issue is a big one. There's actually 2 states in the United States that have passed laws about the use of biometrics. Illinois and Texas are the 2. The difference, like the retina stuff, one of the big differences between the retina stuff, retina work, and the facial recognition piece is the retina work is, as far as I understand, you sort of need some technology. You're going to be there. You're going to have you're going to be scanned, and you're going to know you're scanned. With facial recognition, the quality of camera lenses from vast distances, your inability to even know that you have been essentially, I guess profiled might be the right term. You can't. Sometimes you see things. I mean, which is another. To be honest, it's an ethical issue to me, which is says if any private sector or public sector are using facial recognition in a public place, should there be like conspicuous notice that says, be aware, we're using it. Now, if it's a park, I don't think that works very well because, do you really have a choice not to enter some of these public spaces? I mean, you don't really have. It's hard to say that that's a free choice. In a stadium, maybe you could say, like, look, there's a big event, big soccer match over here at the former Olympic Stadium. Maybe you could, when you sell the ticket, say, be aware, we're going to be using facial recognition at this event to enhance security. And then also probably have some disclosures about what it will do. Like, how will the data be retained? Will it be retained at all? Will you delete the data? How will you manage that technology? So you could decide, well, you know what, if I'm not comfortable with that, I'd rather not go. But I think I think it's different in that respect, that it's just that ability for camera technology has gotten just so good that it feels far more intrusive to me, I think, than some of the retina stuff. But we're definitely doing stuff. Yeah, the Microsoft research team is a large, and we're chatting about this earlier. They are a very independent group of people. They're essentially it's very much run like a university, and it's, the former head of it was the head at Carnegie Mellon's computer science department. And it's just, there's a tremendous amount of academic freedom. So people are working on all sorts of things. And I bet you there's people working on some of the fake news stuff. And I'm going to go find out when I get back.
So I was just wondering about the opt-outs. We all have opt-outs for everything that we put on our smartphones. It's just that the 20 pages long.
Right.
And everybody goes, click.
That was very short, that one I
No,
just showed
absolutely. That was a wonderful example. But they're generically not like that. You can easily just
pass through.
push a bias so that nobody's going to say no because they're going to read all those 20 pages.
The European General Data Protection Law, it does, it increases the standards. There's ambiguity. There's new when you opt in, opt out. Those sorts of things are being governed, I think, more closely now. I think they should be.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name is Gerardo Martinez. I'm Deputy Director of Spectrum Engineering. I work at the Federal Telecommunication Institute.
Very good.
Yeah. I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Are big companies really compromised with warranting ethics? Because it's kind of like speech. I warranty ethics, but suddenly you bump into news that Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and Google and the other way, you have Microsoft. So it's kind of difficult to think from a user perspective that big companies are really warranting ethics by design. No? It's like the new term. So for me, it's very complicated. As you said before, each person has different, I wouldn't say knowledge, I would say understanding, but maybe I would say that perspective of what is ethics. So from my point of view, ethics is these things from your perspective, is your these principal guidelines. So even Facebook guidelines from ethics, Amazon guidelines. So I think it is very complicated, and it gets worse when you have to face as a company data protection law.
Right.
So from your point of view as a user and from your point of view as a person who works in Microsoft, is this really being warranted by these tech companies, or is it just like a kind of fashion word? Thank you.
It's a great question. First of all, on organizational ethics, it's interesting because I sit on this ethics committee, but it's an advisory committee. So I do not determine the company's ethical stance. We have reserved that specifically for our CEO and his senior leadership team, because I have a point of view, I have a set of values, but ultimately, the company needs to chart that course, and they won't. And so, the weapons is a good example. We'll eventually make a decision on weapons. It will inevitably be a decision that will not please everybody. I'm not sure who will make unhappy. If we decide to do something with weapons and there's pacifists that work for us, they will be unhappy. If we decide to not do anything with weapons and there's people who are former veterans and pro-military and national defense, they will not be happy. So there will be people that will be unhappy. The most important thing is, I think, that we do this in a transparent way and we're open and we're communicative about it so that people understand. It's the worst thing that you can do, which is Google got caught up in a different issue, which involved China and the search engine, where they were kind of running a closed project. It was very, small group working on it, and it was to re-enter China with search. And their biggest problem is employees, I think, were incensed to have found out that it was held secretly, and that they weren't aware of it. So ultimately, that decision gets made at the top. Why, to the point of, I think you're saying, is this just words or is this stuff real? For us, it's got to be real. I mean, we are turning down work. We're making public commitments. We are early in the process. So when I think of those principles, I like our principles. I think they're fine principles. They're not that much different than other principles you see in the space. So there's not don't look at that as like Microsoft is really a thought leader on principles. We're sort of all in that kind of category. But the harder work is, all right, what do they actually mean? How do we apply them to our business? And then once we make some of these decisions, how can we then write guidelines? And where can we are starting to draw, what I would call like a red line to say, our salespeople should never go across this line. There are certain countries we will never sell the technology to. Not that we're able to, it's not illegal for us to do it, but we just decided not to because of human rights records. And so those things are real. And the reason that I think it's important, one is, I like to think that we're principled and that we feel that this is exactly the right thing to do. But to be honest, it's also good business, because my experience in talking to customers is customers all want to go down this path. They see this as an opportunity. They have their own data. They want to make some use of that data. They want to learn more about their customers. But they're all nervous because they recognize, because of these headlines, that it's perilous. And so they don't want to make a mistake. And so I think my thesis on this is that they're going to want to work with a vendor who's responsible and has been thinking thoughtfully about this as well. So together we can go down a path and go down the right path. So I think it's good business as well as the right thing to do.
Hi, I'm Laura Vargas from C3. A key point in controlling developments is knowing where they are heading. But what happens when you don't know what will be the applications or the technologies that will come out? Yes. I'm thinking, for example, on molecular biology, when they did the Asilomar meeting, they couldn't believe what was going to happen later with CRISP, for example. Right. And we don't have regulations for that type of things.
Exactly.
So how you see the applications that you cannot foresee now?
It's a great question, and it's a super hard problem. And so where this comes to light for us, probably most directly, is we license our technology probably maybe in two broad ways. One is we go build stuff together with customers all the time. So we have consultants and we have technology people, and they go build things and they work with technology people at company, and it's called our services business. And on that, we have a sense of what they're doing and what they're building and how it's going to be used. Doesn't mean it can't be changed later. And we could sometimes when we license the technology, we will say, license for this use and only this use. And we are saying, if you want to use it for something else, you need to come back. So we'll do that in the services context. The harder issue is we have technology that we just basically put on the shelf, and you can go online and you can download it and you can use it. And we don't know much about you. You just put a credit card in and you're up and running. In that context, today we do have, it is governed by what we call an acceptable use policy. It says basically that you cannot use that technology for anything that's prohibited by law. It says something about you can't use it to engage in cybersecurity or something, cyber hacking and cybercrime, which is also kind of redundant because it's usually illegal, but in any event, we say it twice. But then it also says you can't use it to violate the rights of others. And it's funny, we've never enforced that third one on a human rights basis, to be honest. And the example that we often think about is, we make a product called Word, which is a word processing product. We made it for a long time. We sell it to anybody who wants to buy it. People will take Word and they will write beautifully crafted prose and lovely poetry and things that we'd all be proud to, have and read. But some people take Word and they write terribly hateful things and, racist screeds or whatever it might be. And we don't feel any accountability for that. Like, we don't feel like, well, because they're using Word in a way that we think is completely objectionable, we don't try and stop it. But Word's different than this technology. And so that's sort of the question for us. Now, the hard part is, how do we figure it out? And a recent example, which is, it's related but slightly different, but it's an approach, which is there was a social media site, and maybe it still exists. It was called Gab.ai. I think it might be very U.S. centric, but it essentially was a very right-wing extremist social media site that attracted other people with right-wing extremist views. And then they ended up posting some horrifically bad anti-Semitic statements on their website. It became a news topic. It was written up about how horrible these statements were. Turns out that they were a service that ran in our data center. So we hosted this service for them in our data center. But the commitments we make to our customers is we say, it's your data, not our data. And we basically say, we're not going to look at your data, because customers don't, like, if you're a company and you're doing things, you don't want to basically know that your vendor's sitting there pouring through your records all the time. So we say, we don't look at what you do. It's like, we wall it off. It's your data. We don't have access to it. We'll run it in our data center, but otherwise we're not going to pay attention to it. And so in this case, we didn't know what they did. They just were running in our data center. But when we found out about what they did through the media, we basically said to them, take this down, or we're going to basically sever your contract. And I actually don't know if we actually kicked them out of the data center or if they took it down, but one of those two things happened. So we could theoretically do the same thing in this space. We could license the technology, we could put in these prohibited terms of use, and then if we get notice of misuse, then we could go after the person and make a correction. For the victim, if it's somebody who truly has been victimized by it, it doesn't feel like a great outcome, but it's better than zero.
So just one comment on that. I mean, what that raises is a really wonderful point about the chain of causality. Yeah. Where do you put? So the thing is that, thinking before computers, you could say, well, every purveyor, every seller of pens and paper should be going, no, if you're going to write bad things on this pen, with this pen or on this paper, we're not going to sell it to you, right? Yeah. Or you could even, think of, with the computer, well, the electricity company that provides the electricity for the company to actually use, et cetera, et cetera. Where is the chain of causality and who has what's the degree of responsibility in that chain, right?
My name is Alejandro Herrera from the Philosophy Research Institute.
Oh, very good.
A few steps from here. My question is whether you are working with some American philosophers, ethicists, who, for instance, the 6 principles that you mentioned, how to see how they could fit into some more general principles that are proposed by many, for instance, bioethicists nowadays, to see how can you work for the good of Earth, for the good of humanitarian action, etc.
I would say a little bit, but probably not as much as we should. We do have an ethicist on staff, who's a gentleman named Mark von Hollenbach, who taught at the University of Washington, and I think he still may teach a course on ethics. And so we have him as an advisor. We do bring in outside voices quite a lot, and we're going to do more of that. I was just sharing at the end of the month, we're having a ethics committees coming together for a full day. We're bringing 3 outside resources to come in and spend time with us to basically just so we can get smarter and learn, because the issues are very, very hard.
They will be very happy to work with you.
Oh, very good. All right, good to know. Thank you.
That's a really great point. I hadn't thought of that, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, so here you guys talking about ethics. Well, who's the expert on ethics, right?
Exactly.
So, any more questions? Yeah.
There is kind of also a trade-off between, sorry, I'm Mauricio. I'm studying management, but I'm really interested in data and, I mean, in machine learning and stuff like that. So there is also a trade-off between the data that is published and that is open. For example, government data. It's really important to open some government data so data scientists can work on that data. But there is also a problem opening that data, the one that you mentioned about what kind of data should we open. And sometimes when I face some problems that I want to solve using machine learning algorithms, I can't find accurate data, probably because it's like sensitive data. But if we want to move on to improve machine learning algorithms, but not only machine learning algorithms, but artificial intelligence algorithms, we have to open data. And that it's an issue regarding ethics, because how can we, secure the people's data? I mean, for example, for a hospital and stuff like that, like if you open the data of some patients, probably we can improve the algorithms. I mean, if you just put the algorithm there, probably you can improve it. We don't know it, but probably it can be improved. And so how can we deal with that? Like what data should be opened and what data shouldn't?
It's a great question, and you're right, you're spot on. We need to open more data and have more data. There's a concept out there called data trusts that's sort of bubbling around, where people want, it's sort of essentially they want people to contribute data into sort of these trusts. I think IBM open sourced some data for these uses, or some data sets that they were using, which is, I think, a great idea. The government data, I think, is a good one. There is this whole area of how do you anonymize data, and how do you anonymize data in a way that, I think the reality is, I mean, the challenge we sometimes have with government is, particularly European government, is they'll want, 100% fail-safe anonymization, which is really hard to achieve. But we can get, we can make it very, very hard to sort of trace back and figure out whose data this is. So we have to come up with some sort of a standard on de-identification. But if you can, de-identify the personal data and then use the more, the other data associated around, that could be quite helpful as well as a solution. But it's an area where we think about it. We have a tension within the company right now. Our head of regulatory affairs is an amazingly talented woman named Julie Brill, who's a former FTC commissioner in the United States. She's a very reputable person in the privacy community. She knows all the, the Data Protection Authority, representatives across Europe, because she was essentially the equivalent of them in the United States. And so she is pushing us hard to be very compliant and very sort of pro-regulation, which is a good thing. It's an important thing, particularly in the current climate. But at the same time, we have our engineers who say, we need more data. What they worry about is we will be the most responsible, the most privacy compliant company on the planet that is the least successful, because we have no data to use. So we are trying to work through that tension. And I think things like you're suggesting, open data and those sorts of sources, would be potentially a really good solution for us.
I think one thing there is that often it's a bit of a red herring. I mean, it's a legitimate red herring in one sense, that we're attuned to identify threats more than opportunities. Right. It's just a fact of human evolution, right? So in other words, that's why health and safety is so ridiculously obsessive in Western countries and things like that. So if there's 0.001% chance of, let's call it a false positive, no. Even if the cost benefit of that relative to what you're giving up is just enormously different, right? Yeah. And I think that's goes along the lines of concentrating on facial recognition and things like that. There's certain things that I think we're attuned to. Somebody's recognizing my face or something like that. And it's important to understand why certain issues really trigger when there's probably much worse issues. Then, my example of that would be like nuclear energy versus fossil fuels, right? The number of people that nuclear energy has killed versus fossil fuels, this is not even remotely comparable. But people, radiation, et cetera, et cetera.
A very good point.
And I think with facial recognition, it might be one of those things. It'd be interesting to know why, right?
Yeah, so, it's a good point. We are, the identity, and there is, there is this notion of it's sort of like your face is your face, and it will change over time to some extent. But I think technology is good enough that it figures out how it will change, and so it in some ways if you end up in these databases, it does feel that is an area of concern. But you're right. I'm sure there, and if there's not others out there now, in 2 weeks there will be as the technology sort of marches ahead.
Any other questions? Yep, Javier.
I'm Javier Garcia from the C3. And maybe this will be a difficult question, but that topic of the talk, I think, motivates me to make it. What is the position on open source of Microsoft?
I'm glad you're asking me that now and not a year ago or 2 years ago. I've been 20 years at the company. I was in the field for a long time. For many years, I spent a lot of time on anti-piracy. That was a big part of what we did. We were going to countries like Mexico and saying, we're not getting paid for our software. Government, you need to do more to crack down on this piracy theft. And we work with a company or an organization called the Business Software Alliance, and they would bring lawsuits and so on and so forth. And oftentimes in this space, we were often even sort of suing our own customers because there was a term called underlicense, where they bought some software but not as much as they probably should have, and then we would sort of sue the customer, which is never a good thing to be suing your customers. In probably 3-4 years ago, that business started to sort of tail off as our cloud business started to sort of increase. And then really probably the biggest sea change for us was when we got a new CEO, when Satya Nadella joined, which is now about 4 years, I guess it's been. He's a developer. He's an engineer. He was very familiar with open source, has used open source. He is a big open source advocate. Our Azure data center has now, basically we host tremendous, I can't remember the percentage and it keeps growing, but the number of open source applications that are hosted in that data center is, I think it's approaching 50% if it's not, it's 60%. All right, so it's even at 60. And then the big news is, I don't think we've gotten yet regulatory approval, but we have essentially acquired GitHub, which is the largest developer site in the world for open source development. And it's interesting. I think there are some people in the open source community that are a little nervous, thinking, hey, what's going on? What's Microsoft going to do? But I could tell you, our public and our private commitments are, the way we have been acquiring companies recently is interesting. LinkedIn's another example of this, where we've acquired these companies and then we essentially leave them alone. They get benefit of being part of the organization, but we've let LinkedIn be LinkedIn. We've let LinkedIn grow its asset. LinkedIn has sort of its own CEO. There's a lawyer at LinkedIn who I know quite well named Blake Lawlett, who runs their legal department, but he reports to the business leader in California for LinkedIn, a guy named Jeff Weiner. He doesn't report up through our team on my side. So we pretty much kept it separate. And we'll do the same with GitHub. We'll let GitHub be GitHub. We'll sort of help make it more successful. And it will take time. It's so much of this is about trust. We're going to have to earn the trust of the open source community. But I think that's a big step forward. So you could say right now we are all in with open source. We announced, I think, last week we basically open source. We joined the OIN network, and I know we open sourced a bunch of our patents, and so it's a completely different company at this point in time.
Otra pregunta.
Thank you. According with the example of this guy said before, for example, programming makers always they collect the data in order to build, for example, robots who take pictures for white color of the skin guys, for example. So, but inside this robot, the guy who designed the algorithm itself is that he's the one who is discriminating the people, for example. I mean, the guy who designed the technology, the guy who must know human rights, for example, who is discriminating the personal people, the robot or the guy who is making the algorithm? So I think that maybe engineers in university are not well capacitated somehow in ethics. So I think, and how is Microsoft, for example, or Google or Amazon Web Services working on this topic? Yeah. So it's very difficult because even when we have to talk about human rights, even the guy who makes contracts between the government are the ones who doesn't know very well the human rights. Yeah. So when you think about contracts or algorithms that do not fulfill in this ethics area, so in this moment they don't fulfill the human rights requirements. So how you are facing it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would say my experience in most cases is these are people that are, inadvertently screwing up, and they don't know. Like the Face API example in the New York Times, nobody said, well, this thing's pretty racist, but let's set it out the door. People just missed it. I mean, and so I think it's mostly inadvertently, or it's your point where the technology then was designed for this purpose, and then it gets used for this purpose, and it turns out it doesn't work very well. Or it goes back to the data set examples. I mean, one of the concepts that we are kicking around is apparently in the hardware business, if you're a hardware component manufacturer, you create what they call a data sheet for the components that you create. And the data sheet is very descriptive of your component. It says, here's what the component is, here's what it does, here's how it performs, and here's all the specs about that component. So then when somebody who's basically assembling components to build some system, they now could look at that and say, is this transistor the right transistor or not? I might need a bigger one, or I might need one that's got more power. But with data sets, they just there's a data set. I think it might be hosted by MIT. It's called like Live Faces in the Wild. It's and I don't know that anybody knows what's in that data set. But it's a great big data set. It's got a bunch of faces in it. Everybody uses it all the time. So our proposal is we should put more information around the data set, like describe what it is, describe what it does well. Some data sets, we might create an algorithm to do something in the Pacific Northwest for a Pacific Northwest company. So we would create a data set that we would be representative of the Pacific Northwest. If somebody then picked that data set up and then created an algorithm that they were going to go to India and create a new tool with, it wouldn't work very well. But they need to have notice of like this, just so you know, this is what this data set is. These are the four corners of it. And so don't, that if you're doing something like this, then it's probably a good fit for you. But if not, you might want to look elsewhere. So there's things like that. I think it's mostly, your point's well taken. It's a lot of education, awareness, helping people understand sort of where some of these, risk areas are. That's where it's sort of that consequential use case scenario, particularly we think about, cases where there's really going to be harm if we get it wrong. And so we're working on how to do a better job of getting that more embedded across the company. And it will take time. It's a big company and a lot of people moving fast, but I think we're on a pretty good path.
¿Otra pregunta? Bueno, agradecemos mucho a Rich otra vez.
Thank you.
Y hay varios botones ahí.